thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I think this is a really interesting panel, and it was very interesting to hear the previous talk, and I think there's some synergies that will come out, and I'm sure they'll come out in the questions. So I've been doing game-based immersion design for heritage contexts using, roughly speaking, an action research methodology for the last kind of 5 or 6 years. I come from a games background and a film background. And can I move my slides on? No. Oh, here we go. So really what I want to talk to you a little bit is about, what it's been like working on live game-based immersive experiences within a research context for heritage over the past few years. Really, mainly, there's a team of 3 of us that have been working on this. So a programmer and web expert, a Unity expert, and myself, kind of trying to bring together the kind of art and story of the things that we've been making. So I'm interested very much in how we can bring game loops and game modes of storytelling into an AR and VR context. And I also feel, as the previous speaker said, very strongly that games can add something very important and potent to the way that we get younger people engaging with heritage and history. And I have another kind of thing on my agenda, which is to help Cornish heritage providers kind of navigate the complex world of new technology to see what they can do, particularly as a lot of Cornish museums are volunteer-led, often by people who are kind of my age and over, who are often a little bit scared of the technology. So it's a kind of knowledge exchange project and skill building project, as much as actually building installations for their sites. And then in a broader sense, I'm really interested in what the Museum of the Future might look like. I've got a project at the moment I'm trying to get funded, which is to build online museums with 3D objects from various museums, where you can basically curate your own museum in virtual space to tell different stories, to kind of open up curation. So today, my main focus is to talk about 3 game-based immersive funded projects that we've completed. The Augmented Telegrapher, I'll talk a bit about what we did and what we found out. The Wave project, and something called KERDROYA, hopefully enigmatic terms that I will unpack in a minute. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Cornish context. And I'm sure this will resonate with various people who live in rural areas. So we're remote and rural. Cornwall is quite hard to get to. It's right at the southwest tip of Britain. There's only one road in. There's not many flights, and tourism is the main economy. It used to be fishing. That's a bit contentious right now, and mining. And mines are, there's almost no mining in Cornwall anymore. However, there are around about 90 small museums in Cornwall, all very small, with the exception of 1 or 2, run by volunteers in the main. And the county museum is bursting at the seams. It doesn't know where to put stuff. It hasn't got room to put stuff. So there's one specialist museum that is well funded, and that's Porthcurno Telegraph Museum, which is funded by Cable and Wireless. And you get this kind of landscape here, and I'm sure you'll recognise this if you've worked in this sector. Volunteers are focused on protecting and preserving their collections, not necessarily thinking about who their audience of the future might be and how they might kind of reel them in. So resource and time poor, you know, these museums are kind of driven by that. They are supported though by an advocacy group called Cornwall Museum Partnership, who basically try and up the skills of people and to help people navigate things like health and safety, that kind of stuff. But there is also heritage providers that are not museums, that are more theatre-based, events focused, and we've been working with one of those on the KERDROYA project. I'll talk about that in a minute. And certainly heritage and immersive design technologies is something that's being funded quite well in Britain at the moment. There is a lot of government money going into this. It's sort of seen as the new kind of creative frontier, which is good for us, I guess. I also working in the context of Falmouth Games Academy, and in the past few years we've grown from no students to 600 students studying games. So we like to give them live projects to work in. So these kind of projects give students some hands-on projects on something that is working with external bodies, which I think is really good for their education. I guess the other thing to note is that Cornwall has a very strong sense of its own heritage, which is not English. So in Britain, or in England, which includes Cornwall, whether we like it or not, English heritage, which is the kind of main kind of heritage government body, is very much disliked by a lot of Cornish heritage providers. But basically, it has its own language, like Wales. It kept the Romans out. Very few Anglo-Saxons came here. So strong regional identity, and that's going to be important to bear in mind when we think about what we might be doing here. It's also a very romantic place. Pirates, wreckers, piskies, knockers, witches, pellers, mining, King Arthur, and all that. And rebellion. There has been lots of Cornish rebellions over the years. And then also we've got Du Maurier's stories set in Cornwall, which have kind of informed, you know, Hitchcock movies. I think the shape of horror generally. And I don't know if anybody's played Knights and Bikes, which is a lovely little game by somebody who comes from Cornwall. And there is a way in which Cornwall kind of has a link to sort of Stephen King Lovecraft main country, you know, a bit backward, a lot of kind of ancient history that kind of comes out of the woodwork or even out of the mines in the Hammer horror films. So to pull it back into our general methodology, so really, generally speaking, we do action-based research. Which kind of comes out of education theory, I guess. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it's just the context, you know, generating data, act and reflect, that kind of stuff. But running alongside that, and certainly in tandem with that, is our co-design context. So like the previous speaker, we've been working very, very closely with museum and heritage providers in order to make these things, because I mean, you know, we come in as game designers thinking that we know what we want, and particularly we like kind of Cornish mythology and scary tales, but that's not necessarily the tastes of the museums. So that means thinking about adaptability, working across disciplines, thinking about accessibility, who's got accessibility to the tech, etc., the target audience, and thinking about the museum or the heritage provider's message and intentions. We work broadly in an agile way, you know, a sprint cycle, that kind of stuff, because that helps so we can involve the partner in the sprint, in the sprint setup and in the sprint evaluation, which is a good way of working. And I'll talk a bit about working with partners later. So really, all of this is serving our research focus, which is thinking about interaction design in a games context for heritage research, combined with a focus on interpretational affordances. So I'm interested in the way that things like the HoloLens and VR can give us new interpretational strategies to engage people with history in a vivid way. So the kind of research questions that we're kind of interested in, what are the cultural and interpretational challenges of representing history? That's a perennial question, whether it's new tech or old. What methods are best, are best to support immersive game-based co-design? I found very little research on how to do co-design with museums from a game perspective, and so we built up a body of knowledge around that through these projects. How do we approach different levels of digital and game literacy in a co-design context? It's really sticky and really difficult, and I'll talk a lot more about that later. How do we balance user-centered design with specialist authorship in a co-design context? It's really hard balancing competing opinions about what should be done, what makes a good game versus what makes the good message. What methods work effectively to create a sense of authenticity and incorporation in a game, onboarding, if you like, for museum visitors, and that was something the previous speaker mentioned. What new engagement and interpretive opportunities are on offer? How can we bring past the hidden past to life through game loops? What do they afford us? How can we build sense, feeling, thinking, acting how can we involve all the senses in the experience? So I'm going to look at some of the projects now. Oh, and I guess I think it's important to mention Assassin's Creed, because I always talk about this when I'm trying to persuade museums that looking at game technology is really important. So obviously, the Assassin's Creed and Notre Dame meme is very useful in that sense. So I would argue that the value of game text for heritage is around preservation, cultural relevance, and interpretation. So all three of those sorts of things are incredibly important. So whether that's kind of 3D models of your artifacts in case of fire or losing them, also being culturally relevant to a new audience who are perhaps not that bothered about going to the museum, and of course new ways of interpreting collections, novel ways of interpreting collections. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Augmented Telegrapher, which was our first project, which was ridiculously overambitious, using HoloLens, which was incredibly flaky at the time. But some interesting things came out of that. So the project, and essentially we set the agenda for this project. It wasn't so co-design orientated as the subsequent ones, but we designed a collective puzzle-based escape the room experience using the HoloLens, using haptics as integral to the puzzle solving. Puzzles were required input from multiple people. So we were using the HoloLens in a group context, and people had to solve puzzles together in order to prevent a disaster. It was also set in World War II. You arrive at Porthcurno Telegraph Museum, which is where the old where the telegraph wire from America to Britain comes in, and it was heavily defended in World War II, including flamethrowers and all that kind of stuff on the beach, because that was the key link in between Europe really and America. So the story evolved around the idea that you'd arrived during World War II as a rookie. You're just about to be trained on how to manipulate and fix the cable under the sea, or locate breaks in the cable. But then there's an explosion, and then you're left to have to figure out how to fix a break in the cable in order to keep lines of communication going. So we were trying here to kind of add an extra layer to Escape the Room, to bring in new audiences to the museum, to also have people located in the museum's tunnels, which were, so you get that kind of added kudos. Exploring what we could do with the HoloLens, which turned out to be a bit of a problem actually. So, HoloLens had loads of promises, spatial sound, gaze tracking, gesture input, voice support, shared AR experience, spatial mapping and anchoring. And it is quite easy to kind of just drag and drop stuff into the space, which is really a delight to design for. However, we found that we had a lot of problems with the interface. For anybody who had a go, I mean, I don't know whether the new HoloLens is any better, but the interface was really problematic when we tested. Nobody could use it intuitively. So we decided to make a load of objects that people had to interact with, as well as the holographic imagery. And actually, it made for a more engaging experience. It felt much more pertinent to the museum context because you actually had tactile things. So, for example, we had a Morse code key, an old one that we'd found that you had to use, and various other things. So we also had to solve some problems about the phasing between the different viewpoints of the different HoloLenses. So this is the dream, everyone working on the same object with the different lenses on, but actually this is what happens. Well, as an artist, I'm really interested in this glitch, but it was a real problem, and so we had to build a bit of software in order to help fix that problem. So here's some of the haptic objects that we were using. So what did we learn? You need to complement the museum's existing collections and co-design with the museum. Finding a space, finding support for this project was quite difficult. And then Microsoft stopped supporting HoloLens 1, so a lot of our work was kind of wasted, I guess, really, in some senses, although we did learn a lot. And we would suggest that you do need a team with sufficiently wide applied skills, so interaction designers, asset creators, programs, and curators. So co-design is really important to that. And also have a good fit between the space available and the content, because a lot of museums are really strapped for space, but you also have to think of the space as in terms of theatre design. And also we found that it was best to design the escape room experience for experience seekers, as they're the group with which the format is most popular. And it's a growing format. It does seem to be very popular. It's really, really important to think about how you onboard your players, because they won't understand what to do. And it's really hard to put yourself back in that place of not knowing what you're doing, because if you're building the thing. And also, successful puzzle and problem-solving tasks demands a lot of testing with users. Don't skimp on the time for that. But the HoloLens is easy to design for in lots of ways. It's really easy to get 3D assets and dropped in certain places. And it was great fun to design for. So the other problem with HoloLens, at least at the moment, is that upkeep may be high, and in order to actually do the escape, to sustain the escape the room experience, then the museum staff had to have quite a high degree of knowledge of how to run it, and that became a problem as well. And there was some dissent in the museum about whether or not this was detracting from the reality of the museum, which led to some really interesting conversations. And so, there is inevitably going to be dissonance arising from conflicting aims between the designers and the museum. So I'm aware of time, so I'm going to move quickly on to the WAVE project. This was a 3-year project, ended up being 4 because of COVID. It was a much more, it was working with 5 different museums with a team of 4. To develop some kind of VR or AR application in co-design for each of them. And there was only one of us who were full-time. So there was so resource was an issue. But we were interested in basically increasing their footfall, refreshing their offer, and building a sense that Cornwall may be remote regionally, but it's actually engaging with new tech. So the first one we built was a VR experience to replace a physical VR, a physical experience, which is about piloting a ship into the Bude River from the sea. And so we learned from our previous project and used a real ship's wheel as the haptic controller. And the museum built a little space. It's quite a small space, but we'll put some screens around so people could see what the person with the VR headset could do. We made the experience around about 10 to 15 minutes, but it's bookable. We tried to kind of keep a kind of level of accuracy in terms of the way that the ship looked. And of course, you know, we learned all about how difficult it is to get clean boxes during COVID. So this is kind of somebody having a go at the thing. This is some in-game footage of the boat coming into the harbour, and this is the textures of the boat, the ship. It's probably got a technical name, but I'm not really very boat-y orientated, so forgive me for that. And so how we got to that was quite a lengthy process, and I think it's useful to just kind of talk about how we got to that. So navigating the co-design. So we went and had several meetings with the museum, looked at what they had in the museum and the landscape around it. And some of the stories that they wanted to tell. And then we came up with 3 different scenarios, which they voted on. So they kind of, because they didn't really know what really could be done in VR. So you're starting from a very low base. So you have to listen to them, build some scenarios that work around what they're interested in, and then proffer those, and then leave that to them to decide what actually gets made. So there was a crazy vicar called R.S. Hawker, who was a folklorist, who dressed up he dressed up as a mermaid and smoked a lot of opium, and we really wanted to do a game around him, but they didn't want us to do that. And then we devised a concept for a wrecking game. You know, wrecking was something that happened in Cornwall, so boats, ships being lured onto the rocks so that the local inhabitants could basically steal their stuff. But they didn't want us to do that either. But what they wanted was this ship navigation game, and actually it's very tactile. It really does give you a sense of what it's like to have to pilot this ship from the sea into a narrow river channel. So there's lots of physics going on there. There's a fail state, etc. So quickly moving on, we also made an AR experience for Loo Museum based on, there's an island there which was inhabited by monks in the medieval period. So we made a big table with a model of Loo Island on it, which a local carpenter made for us. And then using iPads, you hold the iPad up, and then there's a little kind of like a monk mystery game that you play, using very different kinds of art style than we used for the previous game, much more sort of Minecrafty, and they were very pleased with that, and we've had some really good feedback about that game. I mean, it's very localized. We needed to have iPads in the museum. It's a tiny museum, so space was incredibly tight. And they have to maintain the iPads, which we had to give them some training on. And just a few more images around that. Okay, and then we made a VR experience for St Agnes Museum. St Agnes Museum is a little tiny harbour town, popular with tourists. There used to be a harbour there, but it fell in the sea. And the museum were really keen that we gave people a sense of what it was like to sit on the harbour back in the day. We couldn't really persuade them that there needed to be a game element to this. They just wanted a static experience, so to kind of demonstrate what you know, to give people a sense of being there in history. And actually, and they built a little. They took a chunk of what was some stones from the old harbour, put them in the museum, put a little corner together with some lighting effects, and you sort of sit in this little booth and then watch things happen around the harbour. One of the good things about that is it definitely put visitors up, but you know, they say that there was 6% up on previous numbers, but obviously COVID kind of made things kind of strange. So it was very popular with older people rather than young people, because I think they probably wanted some game elements. And lastly, we made a walking app for the Isles of Scilly Museum, because Isles of Scilly Museum, actually, the building that it was in was condemned, and suddenly they had to find all sorts of places to put their collections. And so what we made was a walking app using a CMS system that we developed ourselves, so that the museum could kind of upload things to the CMS, and it takes you around to different wrecks on the Scilly Isles, which are kind of, you know, way out into the Atlantic from Cornwall. One of the problems that we had is actually trying to get this thing up onto the Apple Store, because we were developing for the museum. We had huge problems with that. I really recommend that if you are developing for a museum, is that you don't try and get it on the App Store yourself. You get the museum to do it, because it's just been a terrible bureaucratic nightmare. So what did we learn? We learned that there's a way of doing co-design. Could somebody tell me how long I've got left? Sorry, before I start on the new one.
Yes, 4 minutes left.
No, okay, right. But so if you're doing a co-design, it's really important that you have a kind of a well worked out structure that you work with people in, and so it's very important in the concepting phase to have a lot of contact with your museum or your heritage partner. So that means collecting data. It means, you know, everybody knowing what your key performance indicators are, how you're going to collect data. Everybody's goals is aired. You onboard your partners with software development processes and how you work. That you agree a mode of regular communication. You do workshops and focus groups in the concepting phase. You get buy-in from everybody, and then eventually, you know, some kind of signed buy-in after on the concept, because otherwise it'll keep moving. Make sure there's a designated physical space to support what you're doing. And it's really easy to assume that you've agreed a concept, but actually you really need to get your partners to sign off the core loops and the general concept before going into the production phase. Then you go into production phase, normal stuff, you know, code test review, and then at the end of your sprints, have touchstone meetings with the stakeholders and ensure that you've got time for polish. And then in delivery, allocate time to test in situ, because, well, things might work in your lab, they're not necessarily going to work in place. You will spend a lot of time training the staff to use that stuff. I spent a whole day with a group of incredibly willing and really lovely people, so just teaching them how to turn the VR headset on and off. So close communication is absolutely vital. And also I would recommend physical signage on the use of stuff is easier than in-game tutorials if you're strapped for resource. And train, you know, obviously train staff. So this is just the workflow. That's just that in a more tabularized form. And lastly, I was going to talk about KERDROYA, because I think this is an interesting project. KERDROYA is a project which celebrates Cornish hedges. So normally hedges are made of organic mass, you know, sort of vegetation, but in Cornwall they're made of stone and vegetation. And some of them are the oldest in the land. So some of them are perhaps 4,000 years old, and perhaps amongst the oldest human structures. So stone, organic constructions, very distinctive for Cornwall. And so this was a project with the areas of outstanding natural beauty, Golden Tree, and it was funded by the Arts Council. So the different areas of Cornwall have different geology, and so the hedges take different forms and they have different flowers and plants associated with them, and therefore different insects, etc. Now, Golden Tree decided that they were going to build a labyrinth based on the Cretan labyrinth, so a unicursal labyrinth, of which there are examples in Cornwall and in the Isles of Scilly. And this is an enormous thing up on Bodmin Moor, which is a wild place where Jamaica Inn is set, and the Hound of Baskerville, it's sort of Hound of the Baskervilles territory. And you can see the 3D image of it, but also the reality of it in the image here. So our brief was to basically make a walking app to be experienced as people were walking the labyrinth. And in this instance, we didn't have a mediator. We worked directly with the heritage provider, who was a very strong personality. And we settled on an app that worked with a figure from Cornish myth called Jan Tregeagle. He was a magistrate in the 17th century, and he was really horrible. And in local kind of myth, he became kind of a Faustian figure and Hercules. And he had to do a series of labours to stop the devil from getting him. He'd done a pact with the devil, basically. And so we decided to have 12 stations around the journey of the labyrinth that told you the story of Jan Tregeagle, but also took you to other sites where there were other Cornish hedges around Cornwall. So it's a Cornish odyssey, basically. And we were trying to find out whether or not the app engaged people more with the landscape, or whether it and Cornish culture, or whether it kind of detracted from it. We're still waiting to test this in situ, because COVID has made that very difficult. So here's some concept art from it, so this is Jan Tregeagle. So you're basically collecting objects as you go around the labyrinth, which you're finding in a 3D image on your phone of another site, and then putting that item into your inventory in order to basically help Tregeagle escape the devil. So we've got a design loop here, and this is the stained glass that you're putting objects into to kind of resolve the issue. So this is basically what the app looks like. Tregeagle, you're sort of helping him, but eventually he kind of goes through the glass again. So this was another way of developing our expertise of heritage sector. It was using our CMS software that we developed, and it brought together storytellers and writers in a quite complex kind of story, which probably is far too complex if I look at it. So evaluation. This is a much more complex project than the previous ones. It was the app was over complex, too many puzzles, too many elements. You know, I think we've all done this at some point or another. Overscoped. One of them team members left, who actually developed the CMS system and went somewhere else, and it was really hard to find somebody to replace them. Testing in situ became impossible because of COVID, and the site was a long distance from the university. We couldn't get the app on the App Store. We're still trying to get the app on the App Store. So this is a lesson in setting out clear research questions and having very clear agreement with your partner right from the start. We didn't have a mediator here, and I really recommend a mediator if you're embarking on anything like this. So I think that through the trials of this project, we developed a stronger sense of different stakeholders and investment in heritage. We really understood that actually museums are different from a kind of a business eventing kind of heritage context. And also, you know, I think a lot of the problem was that the people we were working with thought that we were just taking stuff off the peg rather than kind of having to put this stuff as a bespoke thing, and they didn't really understand that it was different from a book, that, you know, and in a way, you know, I can see where they're coming from, but it made it very difficult. And actually, from a research point of view, I think it was more valuable than the ones that went well. And certainly, once we get to test it in situ, I think we'll learn a lot more about it. So, what are my conclusions? So immersive experience design benefits to museums. You know, it's about being relevant, being inclusive, being market aware, giving a sense of being there and authenticity, as was mentioned before, being lively, being refreshed, being sustainable, being creative and being resilient. And all of those things, I think, an engagement with this kind of tech it will help with. But we really do need to do more research needs to be done in order to kind of help all of the kind of disparities between them. To summarize, our prescriptions concerns that arise from our work coalesce around three main areas: strategies and approaches to interpretation and representation. Who represents who? New tech doesn't solve the problem of who represents history to whom. New immersive tech, especially VR, fully entrenches a fixed point of view, affords a strong sense of being there. This needs to be remembered if you want to take a constructivist modality to engagement. Game elements should be designed to offset inherent bias. And that's a real problem with VR, I think. Although it can be empathetic, it's a one perspective. Second, issues arising from approaches to design authorship. Co-design comes with a range of challenges. A concept can be diluted when faced with stakeholder investments and competing claims. Agile sprint methodology can help minimize this. Differences in literacies and culture should be overtly aired. Trust needs to be high to help with the inevitable disagreements, and this means taking time to build that trust. Third, the high risk of working with complex technologies. Small museums may not have the resources to mobilize new immersive technologies that are expensive and which present a high risk of failure. As such, we argue that it's vital that new platforms and pipelines are developed to support such museums to enter the digital immersive economy. For this to happen, there must be collaboration and partnership with universities who have the skills and experience with the design and development of immersive experiences. And we hope to have helped facilitate this through this evaluation and development of this collaborative methodology. Lastly, VR offers an elsewhere. XR a here that works with location. But does XR's transparency and sense of presence work to elide the otherness of history? That's a real question for me, and one that I'm really chewing on. What we need to keep in mind as designers and academics is the non-linear complexity of history and the limitations born of the conservative nature of visual representation. And if we don't confront those and just kind of make nice installations and don't think about those things, we're doing history a disservice. Thank you for listening.